Welcome to the second season of Coffee and Conflict, the National Security Institute's literary podcast, where I welcome leading experts to discuss their research, their books, and the most pressing defense and foreign policy issues of the day. I'm your host, Joshua Huminski, a senior fellow at NSI and senior vice president at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So grab your first or second coffee of the day, and let's begin. I'm joined today by Anna Arutunyan, a Russian-American journalist, analyst, and author, and returning guest here. She was born in Moscow, raised and educated in the United States before returning to Russia as a journalist. She has covered 2 decades of Russian politics, first as a reporter and editor at the Moscow News, Russia's oldest English-language weekly, and then as a correspondent and analyst. She has served as Russia's senior analyst for the International Crisis Group, and her articles have appeared regularly in the USA Today, Foreign Affairs, and other publications worldwide. She's the author of several books on Russia, including The Putin Mystique and the latest on Russia's war in Ukraine, Hybrid Warriors, Proxies, Freelancers, and Moscow's Struggle for Ukraine. She joins me today to discuss Rebel Russia, Dissent and Protest from the Tsars to Navalny, published by Polity. Anna, welcome to Coffee and Conflict.
It's great to be here and great to talk to you again, Joshua. I'm really happy that you're having me on again.
It's great to have you back. I mean, this book is absolutely fantastic. This is an advanced copy, so the new one is already out on shelves right now. I want to start off by one of the lines that struck me very early in the book, where you write, in the context of Russia's learned helplessness, which we'll come to, but you write that all of Russian history is a story of dissent and rebellion, which I suspect is somewhat novel framing for listeners. But what did you mean by this, and how do you interpret Russian history this way?
I started actually interrogating several assumptions that I had about Russian history, including one that we are, as Russians, somewhat passive, acquiescing of state power. We treat the government as the weather. It does what it will, and there's nothing we can do about it. I started looking at history, when I was asked to write this book, to look at the history of dissent. And I started asking myself, is this really the case? I mean, what evidence do we have that in the face of an ineffectual government or despotism or injustice of any kind, that Russians just, give up? And the truth is they don't. There is a constant struggle between the government and the governed. And now I don't want to get into the extent to which this is comparable to, in some ways, any relationship between the government and the governed is always a struggle. It's always an evolution. And every country and every culture is unique in that. And I think that in the Russian case, it's not that this struggle doesn't exist. It's not that this dissent doesn't exist. It's that the challenges to forging a more streamlined, a more close and cohesive relationship between the government and the governed they're very strong. What I discovered is, going early on, is that there's this almost chronic alienation between the state and the people. And this is for a lot of natural reasons: distance, the climate, the way that early Russian societies formed, and then as it goes on, ironically enough, one of the main reasons that institutions really fail to bridge this gap between and create the civil society that works in tandem with the government rather than constantly at loggerheads is chronic cyclical revolution. So before these institutions have a chance to take root and grow and establish themselves and create trust, they're swept away by the next set of rebels sometimes turned despots. And historically, this was what I discovered while writing the book. This was a surprise to me, I have to say. But I think we learn as much when we write as when we read.
I mean, could you expand upon that? Because it seems, the idea of rebel Russia is like a persistent undercurrent But is it a cyclical phenomenon that only really flares in crisis, where you kind of have this build up to a friction point, and then there's a break, and then there's sort of the new system? Is this a very cyclical thing, or is this a persistent sort of undercurrent in your mind?
I think it's more cyclical. I want to be careful with the word persistent because that implies a certain inevitability, that this is like, again, that I'm going from one inevitable model to another one. I don't think this is necessarily inevitable. I think that just the way that history has happened so far, the efforts of the government to reform itself, the people's efforts to reform the government have kind of gone like this, and for various reasons at each different time. And I look in the book, I investigate several points of reform processes and revolutionary or pre-revolutionary turmoil. It starts with Ivan the Terrible, and in fact his reforms, and why he went from government reforms to a complete revanchism. He stopped working with the aristocracy, and started relying on the landed gentry, thus creating the oprishnina, because he felt betrayed by the boyars. He felt insecure with them. They were becoming too strong as a class, so they were becoming strong, but clearly not strong enough to stand up to him. So he sweeps away his earlier model of reform and goes and embraces the new nobility, which I think has a lot of parallels to what Putin is doing over the last 20 years, but I'll get ahead of myself. Then there's the period of the reforms of the 19th century, when, again, the government is trying to reform a huge system, and it just doesn't happen fast enough. So you have Nicholas I surprisingly inheriting the throne, which was unexpected to him. And he has all these plans for reforms, but instead he's dealing with the aftermath of the Decembrist revolt. His government has to become more repressive in order to hold on to his throne, and in order to hold on to his dear life. In other words, the reforms take the back burner, and they're not implemented until his son, the reformist Tsar Alexander II, takes the throne and implements them. And ironically, days before he was due to grant Russia a constitution, or the first semblance of a constitution, he's assassinated by the people's will, a movement that felt that reforms are not going fast enough. We have to turn to regicide. In other words, the repressions of the repressions of his predecessor, what they do is they stifle civil society to the extent that only the most radical ones survive, and the most radical ones then go on to assassinate his son. So again, I think this pattern tends to repeat, and it repeats itself in that the government has to be repressive because it's weak. It's not bolstered by institutions. It's not bolstered by any deep intrinsic connections with the population that it governs. And so to compensate for that weakness, it constantly has to resort to either potentially repressions or just outright repressions, as we saw during the 20th century.
Building off of that, I mean, to what extent do these recurring authoritarian patterns, I guess, reflect individuals at the top of the system? You mentioned the czars, the general secretaries, or presidents, versus sort of structural features of the Russian state. I mean, how much is it individuals' attempts at elite reform or systemic reform, and how much of it is just features of this friction that you're talking about, of the disconnect between civil society and the political reform?
Well, this actually is very significant, and it speaks to the historically the institutional weakness of the Russian state. Now, in the Putin mystique and elsewhere, I've described a very patrimonial, personalistic autocracy, and it's actually in the last 2 decades, it's become very popular to refer to the mafia state, where instead of institutions, you've got a government that resorts to just the more archaic forms of rule, loyalty, fear, charisma, all of the features of a personalistic autocracy. In fact, I think what this is that what we forget is that Russia, and increasingly now, I think, there are institutions, and they I think under Putin was this whole different topic, but it's just that they are not always sufficient to rule, particularly in times of crisis. They're not sufficient to lean on because usually they are young. They have not had the time to establish themselves for whatever reason, and as a result, this personalistic, charismatic power takes over, and it does so more than it should, but it does so precisely to preserve itself.
Building off of that, what I think is really interesting is certainly in Western and American culture and society in particular, there's a certain romanticism about like the rebel, about the dissident, about the opposition figure. I mean, how is that seen in Russian political and Russian civic culture? I mean, is it the same sort of admiration, or is it a function of a tension between sort of wanting change but being fearful of change? I mean, what is sort of the rebel's role in Russian society and Russian perspective?
This again, it's very interesting as a historical and intellectual phenomenon because one of the key features of the classic dissidents of the Soviet Union that we encounter in this book and just in literature is there's this moral absolutism. There's this sense of seeking the truth, and I'm seeking to live in the truth. It's almost a religious concept, and indeed it has a lot of religious origins. I mean, I trace this back to the holy fool concept, which is a little bit tenuous, but for me it's always been an intriguing parallel. I think that when you have a society that is as alienated from its government as in Russia, when social ties are very weak, and this, especially in the Middle Ages, when, unlike Europe, you have settlements that are extremely close-knit, but not very communicative with other settlements, or especially with outsiders. You have this very almost oppressive sense of community within, where you don't have a lot of room for individuation. But on the other hand, what you do have, and this goes back again to the Middle Ages, is the habit of fleeing your commune, fleeing the confines of your prince's feudal structure, becoming the runaway serf becomes a Cossack, for instance. In other cases, he or she becomes a hermit, an отшельник, a юродивый, holy fool, a fool for Christ. In other words, breaking from the bonds, from these survivalist bonds of society that essentially the climate imposes on you, and living your life as you will in utter freedom, but unprotected by society, by the state, by anything. And the funny thing is, there was a lot of admiration for this sort of thing. As much as they are persecuted, as much as they can be persecuted, they are also admired, because this is a very gutsy and brave thing to do. You're foregoing the protection of society, of your loved ones, of whatever, basically for a moral principle. And now in the 1960s, of course, this is a completely different environment, but in some ways you're doing something similar. You're standing up for the truth, whatever that may mean for your loved ones, whatever that may mean for actually helping the kinds of reforms that you want to make happen. But no, you're just doing this because it's the right thing to do. And in some ways, this is this is indeed extremely admirable and brave. But on the other hand, what it doesn't really accomplish is creating ties, bridging the alienation of communities, creating a not just individual agency, which I think Russia is very strong on, but collective agency, where people have common interests, where they gain by their numbers in negotiating power with the government, and actually by that kind of compromise, by that kind of community sense, in fact, reform. And because we don't really see a lot of this, we see instead a lot of very individualistic rebellion, very individualistic kind of refusal to accept. Compromise is a dirty word. Compromise should not, in this kind of culture, it's not acceptable. And there's reasons for this. It doesn't really lend itself to kind of political evolution that I think Russia could really benefit from.
There's a couple threads I really want to tease out there, but I want to stick with that moral and spiritual dimension of the protest, because it seems very present in the Decembrists or Tolstoy. But do you see it carried through towards sort of the late Soviet era, which you touched on, sort of the '60s a bit, and perhaps to the modern protesters? I mean, when you look at the opposition landscape today, what is the sort of moral or spiritual dimension to it, and is it present?
This is very interesting. I mean, I think that in terms of the kind of the moral universe, or the moral environment that people are operating in Russia, it's very popular to say that there is none anymore. That through the 90s and since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there is no moral identity. I am skeptical of this kind of essentialism. I mean, I think that a lot of Russians, I hear this from a lot of Russian emigres, and I think that it speaks to an inner depression about the state of what is going on with their country, the state of disconnect of yourself from your fellow, from people who speak your language, and the values that they hold. And I think that to kind of cope with that cognitive dissonance, that you find nothing in common, you can't understand how people who are your countrymen could do certain things, you resort to the more comfortable notion that there's some kind of huge moral crisis that is, that the majority of people live in, and you are somehow different from this. This is, of course, I mean, there might be some truth to it, but it is essentially a psychological coping mechanism rather than an analytical framework that reveals the truth about society, because societies are exceedingly more complex than that, and Russian society especially so. I think that with regards to the role of the Soviet dissidents, is that throughout when the Soviet Union collapsed, and you had this, essentially you didn't have those kind of totalitarian constraints. You didn't have the same level of repression. You had suddenly a blooming civil society. You had all sorts of political parties. You had all sorts of, different political ideas. The Soviet dissident model that adhered to one truth, one way of doing things, one right way, it was outdated. It wasn't, you needed more figures who were able to bridge the gap with all of these different new civil society units. And the Soviet dissidents were really unprepared for that.
I want to go back to one of the points that you had just raised previously about the broad base, or the shared community of sort of opposition and dissident. Is that one of the reasons that Alexei Navalny in particular was such a threat to President Putin in terms of an opposition figure? Because it seemed, and do correct me if I'm wrong, from an outside perspective, that his fixation on corruption and anti-corruption served to sort of cross-cut Russian society in a way that previous movements or opposition efforts had been much more siloed or stovepiped, if you will.
Mhm. I think Navalny represented something absolutely new that broke with all, that broke out of these cyclical, almost dualistic models of good versus bad, government versus the people. It was more about building a society in a country that we're all invested in, and cutting across the political cliques that had established themselves to actually get at a more unifying idea that this is our country that we love, that we want a future for. It's a European country that has all the potential to be like any other country. We just need to work together to do it. It was a very positivist idea, and in this, Navalny really broke from again the liberal past the Soviet dissidents, and therefore their liberal opposition that was wrongly, mistakenly seen as really the only or the main Russian opposition. This was never the case. The Russian opposition was always very varied, and probably the stronger Russian opposition were the more leftist, nationalist elements that, associated more closely with the Communist Party, for instance. Navalny managed to kind of bridge that gap. He came from Yabloko, the liberal party. He was kicked out of Yabloko for saying things that for really flirting with certain ethno-nationalist tendencies that were kind of popular around the time. But in the process, what that really meant was that you had a figure, for once, that was able to actually talk to all sorts of different people. And this was not, you did not see this. You did not see Soviet dissidents talking to or working to well you did sometimes, but rarely, working with factory workers who were on the ground. Those, it was all very insulated. You had your own clique, and you didn't really talk to outsiders because you had reasons not to trust them. They were probably working for the KGB. I mean, and likewise for the liberal opposition. It's a very insulated culture where outsiders are immediately mistrusted. They are potential FSB plants. Everybody's a potential FSB provocateur. So you don't really talk to outsiders. You don't really talk to people who might agree with you on one point but disagree with you on another point. Navalny, now he was a very, let's say, strong. He was authoritarian in his own way. In other words, he believed in what he believed, and he could be very disagreeable. He could be a bit of a jerk, aren't we all? But what he did do is talk to people. He debated with people. He debated with anybody. He debated with Igor Strelkov Yurkin, the warlord of Novorossiya, the former FSB officer who went into eastern Ukraine and started the insurgency, the pro-Russian insurgency in 2014. He talked to nationalists, he talked to liberals, he talked to communists, and in doing so, he basically started creating a network a network of civic action that Russia hadn't really seen before. And this is where I see precisely these shifts of that isolated model changing under Putinism. That on the one hand you still have an increasingly repressive regime. On the other hand, you have, over the last 2 decades, you actually have a civil society. It's very weak. It's still very repressed, but it's there because you've got the Navalny model. You've got all sorts of other models of communication and outreach that are competing with Navalny. And indeed, if we look at the the ecosystem of the exiled Russian oppositionists and how viciously they're fighting with each other, you can see just how viciously that competition for leadership is playing out. But within Russia, these models are there. The practice is in place. It just needs a chance to grow.
I want to stick with the sort of Putin's time in power and the change that you've seen over his duration in office, where he sort of inherited from Yeltsin a semi-open environment, certainly much more dynamic space for political conversation, through to where we stand today, sort of post February 2022 and post Navalny. How has this environment changed, and how has this transformation under President Putin, how does it fit within the sort of cyclical changes that you've identified over the course from the Tsars through the Soviet period?
Well, this is precisely it. It fits straight into the same pattern we see recurring from the time of Ivan the Terrible. And I don't want to create cause for inevitability. I think a lot of things are changing, but that primary model is you have a government in place, a new leader comes in, understanding that in order to modernize and in order to create a stable, strong government, we need reform. We need institutions, we need an institutional, well, whatever you want to call it, democracy or whatever, but you need institutions. You need an institutional transfer of power. You need to bring the people on board. You need to have strong institutions that are going to outlast this personalistic whatever, that are going to protect you. That is incredibly hard to do. So Putin comes in this, new climate, but he starts clamping down, to protect himself, and he starts clamping down precisely on the oligarchic class that had established itself by then. He creates his own oligarchs, really. He kind of puts pressure on the old ones, the ones that were backing Yeltsin, and he brings in his own friends, Timchenko, Kovalchuk, his own guys. So essentially, there's all this talk of Putin's cronies and the Ozero cooperative, his dacha buddies. But essentially, what he was doing was replacing the old set of oligarchs with his own oligarchs who are going to be loyal to him. That's not necessarily a great thing to do, but hey, it worked for his predecessor. He's going to think it's going to work for him. And he does what he can to reform. And I think that I'm saying a pretty heretical thing here. Oh my God, Putin a reformist? What are you talking about? Well, what did he do in 2008? He stepped down. He stepped down in favor of his trusted liberal protege. And I'm thinking, and then the idea was, well, he couldn't change the Constitution to stay in power. Of course he could. If he wanted to stay in power, he would have changed the Constitution and stayed in power. He did it later anyway. And he was strong enough to do it then. But he wanted to give liberalism a chance or whatever. And to do so, he needed to do so in a managed way. So he kind of stepped back, but not too far, so he could control things and see what Medvedev could do. I mean, he was still obviously overseeing the important stuff, but let's see how these, democratic institutions, how this liberal, creative business class can evolve. And what happens is that it evolves, it becomes stronger, it becomes more hopeful, it gains agency, and it turns against the system. In 2012. When Putin decides to return and says, okay, enough of this, and there were all sorts of reasons why. I mean, it was basically, as often happens when the government allows reform, is they kind of start running away. Society kind of goes further than the government hoped. We saw this incidentally with Khrushchev, who also wanted to see, after the totalitarianism of the Stalin years, he wanted to allow civil society to grow. He wanted to allow these freedoms. And then he had to put his foot down because it just got a little bit too shaky for their comfort. And this is exactly what happened again in 2012. This is exactly what happened with the reforms of Alexander I in the first decades of the 19th century, which led to the Decembrist revolt. Again, reforms are happening. There's a lot of talk, but they're not going fast enough. So the people revolt against the government, which they see as the main impediment to actual liberal reform. So what does the government do? It clamps down further. It stops the reform process. It introduces repressions. It leans on different sectors of society to sort of divide and rule. So Putin, instead of leaning on the cosmopolitan business class now leans on the nationalists and the security services, the factory workers, the make Russia great again, Russia's answer to MAGA. He leans on them now. He allows them to, in 2014, go to the Ukrainian mainland and start a revolution. Not really sure where this is going to go, but then it turns into the war that we have that is still in its fourth year, but actually started in 2014. He aligns himself in order to stay in power, not with the liberal classes that he feels became too strong and betrayed him, but with the nationalists, who he was also very, initially averse to. He was, I don't really believe him to be a nationalist imperialist. Like, this is not who he was when he started out. But he aligned himself with them, again, in order to stay in power.
I want to stick with that because you've written about sort of the sacred idea of power in Russia. I mean, how has Putin adapted that sort of political ideology for the 21st century, especially as this window of legitimacy has narrowed, and he's sought to align himself with these groups that can ensure the stability of his power?
I think this is a process that started in 2012, again, in response to the protests, when he started courting the more conservative elements of society. And one of the pillars of that, of course, is the Orthodox Church, which has, throughout Russian history, been very closely aligned with the state. There was, unlike in Europe, unlike with the Catholic Church, there really was never any opposition between the Russian Orthodox Church and the government, except for a small period of time during the Nikonov reforms, when in fact the pro-government reformist Nikon prevailed over the more traditionalist Avakum. And you had the schism that resulted in the newly aligned Orthodox Church and the old believers who stuck to more traditional rituals. But essentially, you had a church that was working in tandem, in symphony, as the term goes, with the government. This persisted up until the revolution of 1917. And when Putin sought to kind of find new allies in society, precisely to mitigate this alienation of the state, because again, we're talking about pretty chronic alienation. When you lack institutions, you are essentially alone. You need allies. If you can't rely on the middle class, you got to find new ones. So hence we had the alignment with the Russian Orthodox Church and some of its most fanatical adherents. Now the trouble with that is that what we saw, what I observed in Russia, up until in the decade after 2012, is that the government would also have to step in and kind of constrain these people, because sometimes they just they would go too far in trying to ban movies or outlaw abortion or all sorts of things. Putin was kind of like, okay, I want to lean on them, but I also want to show that the Kremlin is actually we're the most Europe. We're not like these guys. There was also the benefit of that. We're not as extreme and conservative as them. So, stability. So I think that is how kind of he tapped into this. And unfortunately, I think in some ways, although I don't think this was the main factor of his decision to invade Ukraine, I think in some ways the desire, the pro-war party that had been angling for a more aggressive approach in Ukraine, it won out also on this idea that power must be sacred, that and if it's that sacred, then people must be willing to die for it. Then we have to be willing to fight and to die to uphold our values, because we are in an existential struggle with the West. This narrative was, I think, Putin kind of flirted with it, but then it ran away, and he had to kind of follow.
And I highly recommend for any listeners to pick up Anna's previous book, Hybrid Warriors. It is a fantastic insight into the outbreak of the conflict of 2014. But I want to stick with the Ukraine and sort of what has happened since the full-scale invasion in February 2022. How has the room for dissent within Russia changed or adjusted, or is it a continuation of the previous repression that you have seen within Russian political space?
It's very hard to tell right now, again, because very few are traveling to Russia. It's very hard to talk to people in Russia because you don't want to put yourself in danger, you don't want to put them in danger. But I've always said, I mean, initially, like a lot of people, I was horrified by what I was seeing. I left in March 2022, and it was just the fear that you felt was palpable. And so it was, oh my God, is this a new totalitarianism? In hindsight, I think that this kind of analysis is not really historically accurate. This is not anything like 1937. It's more like the Soviet Union in the 70s. I think initially, because there was this whole storm of new draconian laws that were very often selectively implemented precisely to jail a few people so that the rest would fall in line. It wasn't really clear where the repressive red lines were. I think over the years we're seeing a kind of, over the last 4 years, a more I hate to say predictable model, but at least it's settled down where people are basically, they have a sense of what you can and can't say better than they did at least 4 years ago. I think that's going to continue. I don't really see any type of thaw coming anytime soon. I think we're still going to see the same repressive climate. But I think in this, we have to be honest about what this repressive climate is. It is authoritarian, pretty typically. So it's not totalitarian. This is, I think, that would be hyperbolic. I think that the government, again, because it resorts to again, this model of you don't have a repressive apparatus that jails people by the thousands. It's a repressive apparatus that jails, precision repressions, as it's often called, jails a few. This is reported by the liberal and oppositionist media. Everybody reads the liberal and oppositionist media, and everybody's scared. And that's how the model works. So, in other words, what you have, if you look at the statistics of overthere.info, which is it's a human rights organization working inside Russia. They have hundreds of lawyers helping political people who are prosecuted for political reasons. They help them defend themselves. They report how many jailings there are for political voters. Right now, I think I haven't checked the latest numbers, but the number of people in jail for political crimes is less than 2,000. That's across the country. That's 3,000 if you look at all of the administrative cases. Some of those people are not in jail. But that's less than 2,000. And I think that includes the number of people who are, jailed under the most repressive, scary criminal articles, such as treason, which is only I think we've seen only about a few hundred of those. Now, again, all of these cases are horrible and terrifying and scary and should not be happening. But we need to look at the scale to consider that out of 140 million people, and out of thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people who find ways to publish and protest and do whatever, less than 2,000 people are in jail for this. That means that society is still functioning. People are still fighting. People are still voicing their opposition to the regime. They're doing it in very careful ways. And I say this again and again. Again, a very heretical thing to say. There is civil society in Russia. It's just not working openly. We can't really know a lot about it. It's certainly not represented by the exiled opposition, or by the opposition abroad. But it's there. And if you look, one example I like to cite is Over the Info. The very fact that they've got these hundreds of lawyers working with people across the country. And it's not the only organization that does this. They're just doing this quietly. I mean, sometimes they'll advertise what they're doing, but they try to avoid that because it's dangerous. They do what they can. And in the process, as I note in Rebel Russia, this is actually the most productive part of reform. It's you have one lawyer talking to a judge, talking to a prosecutor, talking to a police officer. In the process of this conversation, the seeds of change are planted. Once the government allows that to happen, you have these new values, these new ways of doing things that are already there. They're just not really implemented, but the seeds are there. And it's a long-term process, but we have to believe in it. These things don't happen overnight. It took Europe thousands of years, hundreds of years. Why would it happen overnight in Russia?
This is probably going to be following on sort of a heretical sort of thought, but where does Yevgeny Prigozhin fit into this whole dynamic? Because we saw the attempted mutiny and a very clear, visible rebelling against the Putin regime. Does he fit in this continuum? Is it a local, isolated incident, or is he emblematic of something larger?
Well, incidentally, there's a chapter devoted to him in Rebel Russia, where I compare him to Emelian Pugachev, the Cossack rebellion that he led in the second half of the 18th century. This is that Cossack rebellion was again Cossacks who were disgruntled by being mistreated and used to fight Russia's wars abroad, but basically treated unjustly. And you have somebody like Prigozhin, who likewise, it's a private army that the government relied on, didn't really allow him to take credit, didn't really give him the ammunition he needed, did its usual thing of taking them for granted. There's an injustice. Injustice very often, if it's persistent enough, it turns into this meaningless revolt. And again, in Rebel Russia, there are the moral dissidents, right? There's this moral purism, but on the other side there is the merciless and senseless Russian revolt. To quote the poet Alexander Pushkin, who was describing the Pugachev rebellion, it's a senseless revolt based on the sense of injustice. If things are so unjust, there must be a false czar. In the case of the Pugachev rebellion, with Prigozhin, it didn't quite go that far. Prigozhin was merely talking about the injustice of the Ministry of Defense, and he wanted the leaders of the Ministry of Defense to be fired. But I think it spoke to something wider than that. And in fact, I think the fear of that senseless, merciless revolt was what stopped it from succeeding. Everybody was afraid, including Prigozhin, of what they were about to unleash. And in fact, when Prigozhin kind of called off his forces, nobody was sure where this was going to go, because when he started marching on Moscow, Kremlin officials were silent. They weren't really rushing to condemn him. So it was a really scary couple of days that, and surely you don't want a bunch of mercenaries who are, by the way, still illegal under Russian law to be the victors of a revolt. Surely this is not what you're thinking of if you're, thinking of some kind of reform or change in government, right? So, but I think it does fit into this pattern of the possibility of every revolt and revolution turning. It's not, after all, it's not the moral dissidents who are gonna succeed and win. It's often precisely the most ruthless, the most violent, the most extreme elements that succeed in overturning state power. And I think that what the failed revolt showed is that society is aware of this. They don't want this pattern repeated.
Well, sticking with that, and I think this will probably be the last question, is you've touched upon the ability and change in civil society that's happening within Russia today. You've talked about how Putin is becoming using tools of repression, but perhaps not as widespread authoritarian, but not totalitarian. If we look at the future, there's such a question that's always asked is like, who comes after Putin? But what comes after Putin? If we look at this sort of cycle of repression and reform and liberalization and attempts at reform, what do you see is coming next, given the conditions that we see today? Is this more of a continuation of the same? Is it going to be a resumption of a cycle, or is there space for um, accepting and tolerating sort of dissent and reform in a controlled manner?
I think that what we're going to see, I mean, this idea that the war in Ukraine is somehow going to lead to a defeat of the Putin regime from within or whatever, this is nonsense. It's not. That is not going to happen, and that's a good thing. Because if we look again, if we look at the history, any violent overthrow of power, it leads to institutional collapse, and it leads to eventually more authoritarianism. What I'm seeing is actually a very boring and in some ways depressing picture, but in the long term could actually be very positive. So in the short term, I see a continuation of the current status quo, even if we see a peace deal, even if we see a cessation of hostilities between Russia and Ukraine. I think that the repressive climate is going to continue after that until until there is a change in power. And then what I think will happen is hopefully this will not be a violent or unexpected overthrow. It will either be Putin stepping down and through whatever legal institutions that he chooses, either nominating a successor or his natural demise, and then in other words, the prime minister or whoever coming into power, and then an election is held. The elections are probably going to be managed just as elections have been over the last 2 decades. But gradually, in the next cycle, we will see a thaw. We will see an easing of repression simply for, because it's good for business. We'll see, and maybe we'll see this even sooner with, depends on how how the talks with the United States go. If there's a, resumption of business as usual, it would make sense to kind of ease things up a bit to precisely attract more business from the West. Russia doesn't have to do this. It's perfectly happy right now doing business with the global South as it has shown. But of course, more money is never a bad thing. So this is going to be long and slow, but I think that in the long run, if we are to avoid a cataclysm, and I'm going to say something very heretical here that no one's going to want to hear, Russian democracy is going to arise when we don't have a revolution, when we don't have regime change, when we don't have all of these newsworthy, fast-paced, Netflix-worthy shows, when we have something relatively boring and slow. And then all of a sudden you might see somebody new coming in, and the institutional base is sufficiently strong to allow the kind of reform potential that has been building up to actually be implemented, if that makes sense. It's a very rosy picture, I must say, but that's what we have to hope for.
I think it's fantastic. It's a great note on which to end, and I think that's going to bring our this latest episode to a close. Anna, I want to thank you for joining us today. Thanks as always for Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, the entire NSI staff, and helping produce today's episode. Coffee and Conflict is available on Spotify and other fine purveyors of podcasts. This episode will also be available on YouTube at NSI's webpage, and make sure to join us for our next episode in just 2 short weeks. As always, if you like what you've heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And most importantly, pick up Rebel Russia. It is available now from Polity. Anna, thank you so much for an absolutely fantastic conversation and some wonderful insights into Russia and Russian history, civil society, and the role of the rebel and dissident in Russian politics.
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you for your questions. Really fascinating conversation with you. So I'm really glad to be here.
Look forward to hosting you again soon.
Thank you.